In the unforgiving deserts of Afghanistan, where the line between life and death is measured in split seconds, Captain Sarah Ghost Martinez learned a truth that would reshape modern aerial combat forever. When enemy forces launched their most sophisticated air attack in decades, sending their finest pilots in advanced fighter jets to hunt down a single Apache helicopter, they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the woman behind the controls. What happened next defied every military textbook, shattered conventional wisdom about air-to-air combat, and left seasoned generals questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. This is the true story of how one pilot's unconventional thinking, razor-sharp instincts, and fearless determination turned a suicide mission into a legend that still echoes through military academies worldwide. Some say you could hear her laughter over the radio frequencies as enemy aircraft fell from the sky one by one. Others claim it was just static interference. But every pilot who witnessed that day knows the truth. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and sometimes the impossible becomes inevitable. This is her story. Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her helmet one final time as the pre-dawn darkness enveloped forward operating base Chapman. The familiar weight of her flight gear felt like a second skin after 8 years of flying Apache helicopters through some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. At 32, she had logged more combat hours than pilots twice her age, earning the call sign Ghost for her ability to appear and disappear from enemy radar like a phantom in the night. The mission briefing had been routine, at least by Afghanistan standards. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value target moving through the Korengal Valley, a notorious Taliban stronghold where American forces had lost more soldiers per square mile than anywhere else in the country. Sarah's Apache, call sign Devil 67, would provide close air support for a special forces team attempting to capture or eliminate the target before sunrise. Her co-pilot and gunner Lieutenant J. Bulldog Thompson was already running through the weapons systems check when Sarah climbed into the cockpit. Thompson was 26, fresh from flight school, but sharp as a razor. He had been Sarah's partner for 6 months now, and they had developed the kind of wordless communication that kept crews alive in combat zones. All systems green, Ghost, Thompson reported through the intercom, his voice steady despite the early hour. Hellfire missiles loaded, 30mm cannon ready, and we've got a full load of rockets. Weather's clear with minimal wind. Should be a smooth ride. Sarah nodded, starting her own pre-flight routine with a methodical precision that had become second nature. She checked the collective, cyclic, and pedals, ensuring every control responded exactly as expected. The Apache was a formidable machine, bristling with sensors and weapons, but it was also incredibly complex. One small malfunction could turn a routine mission into a death sentence. Tower, this is Devil 67 requesting clearance for departure. Sarah spoke in her headset microphone. Devil 67, you are cleared for takeoff. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. Good hunting out there. The Apache lifted off smoothly, its twin engines settling into their familiar roar as Sarah guided the aircraft into the pre-dawn sky. Below them, the lights of the base quickly disappeared, replaced by the dark, mountainous terrain that had claimed so many lives over the past decade of conflict. As they flew toward their designated area of operations, Sarah's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her father the night before. Colonel Martinez, retired Air Force, had called from Texas to check on his daughter. He had flown F-16s during the Gulf War and understood the unique pressures of combat aviation, but he still worried about her every single day. You know, Mija, he had said in his gentle voice, when I was flying fighters, the biggest threat was other fighters or surface-to-air missiles. You Apache pilots have to deal with everything ground forces face, plus you're flying a slower target. Just promise me you'll trust your instincts out there. Trust your instincts. Sarah had built her entire career on that philosophy. While other pilots followed doctrine to the letter, she had always been willing to improvise when the situation demanded it. It was a trait that had earned her both commendations and reprimands from superior officers who preferred their pilots to color inside the lines. The Korengal Valley appeared ahead of them as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern mountains. Sarah reduced altitude, using the terrain to mask their approach from potential threats. The valley was notorious for its complex geography, with steep ridgelines and narrow passes that could easily become death traps for unwary pilots. "Ghost, we're getting radio chatter from the ground team," Thompson reported. "Sounds like they've made contact with the target. They're requesting immediate air support at grid reference 74 Alpha 669er. Sarah banked the Apache toward the coordinates, the aircraft responding instantly to her touch. Through her night vision system, she could see muzzle flashes in the darkness below, indicating that the Special Forces team was engaged in a fierce firefight. "Bulldog, designate targets and prepare to engage. Let's give our boys some breathing room." Thompson worked his targeting systems with practiced efficiency, identifying enemy positions through thermal imaging and laser designation. "I've got multiple hostile positions on the ridgeline, approximately 800 meters north of friendly forces. Permission to engage. Cleared hot. Take them out." The Apache shuddered slightly as Thompson fired the first Hellfire missile. Sarah watched the infrared signature streak across her night vision display before impacting precisely on target, eliminating an enemy machine gun position that had been pinning down the ground forces. "Direct hit. Target destroyed," Thompson confirmed. Moving to secondary targets. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah and Thompson worked in perfect coordination, systematically destroying enemy positions while avoiding friendly forces below. It was dangerous work, requiring split-second timing and absolute precision. One mistake could result in friendly fire casualties, ending both their careers and their ability to live with themselves. As the firefight intensified, Sarah noticed something unusual on her radar warning receiver. Multiple aircraft were approaching from the northwest, flying low and fast. Her blood turned to ice as she realized what she was seeing. "Bulldog, we've got company." Multiple fast movers inbound from the northwest, bearing 310 degrees. Count shows 4 aircraft, probably MiG-29s based on the radar signature. Thompson's head snapped up from his weapons display. "MiGs? Out here? That doesn't make sense." Intelligence said the Taliban doesn't have any operational aircraft. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Either intelligence had been wrong, or these weren't Taliban aircraft. The thought that foreign powers might be directly involved in the conflict sent a chill down her spine. Regardless of their origin, 4 fighter jets against a single Apache helicopter was not a fair fight by any measure. "Tower, this is Devil 6-7. We have multiple unidentified aircraft approaching our position, requesting immediate backup and clarification on rules of engagement." The radio crackled with static for several long seconds before the controller's voice came through, tight with concern. "Devil 6-7, be advised all friendly aircraft are accounted for. Unknown contacts are presumed hostile. You are cleared to engage in self-defense." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she processed the situation. She was about to face the nightmare scenario that every helicopter pilot dreaded: air-to-air combat against fixed-wing fighters. The Apache was designed primarily for ground attack missions, not dogfighting with jets capable of speeds 3 times faster than her maximum velocity. "Bulldog, what's our missile inventory?" "We've got 6 Hellfires remaining, but they're designed for ground targets. The Seeker heads aren't optimized for air-to-air engagement against fast movers." Sarah made a quick decision that would have horrified her instructors at flight school. Instead of attempting to flee or calling for backup that might not arrive in time, she chose to attack. It went against every principle of aerial warfare, but something deep in her gut told her it was the right move. "We're going offensive. Plot an intercept course for the lead aircraft." "Ghost, are you sure about this? An Apache versus MiGs is suicide. Trust me, Bulldog. They're not expecting us to attack. That gives us one advantage, and sometimes one advantage is all you need." Sarah pushed the Apache to its maximum speed, racing toward the incoming fighters at nearly 200 miles per hour. It was still pathetically slow compared to the jets approaching them, but speed wasn't the only factor in aerial combat. Surprise, tactics, and pure determination could sometimes overcome raw performance advantages. The first MiG appeared on her targeting system as a white-hot signature against the cold mountain backdrop. Sarah could see the pilot had spotted them and was beginning an attack run, probably intending to eliminate the helicopter with a single missile shot. What happened next would become a stuff of legend among military pilots worldwide. though few would believe the official reports when they were eventually declassified years later. Sarah waited until the last possible second, allowing the MiG to commit to its attack vector before executing a maneuver that should have been impossible for an aircraft the size of an Apache. She pulled back on the collective while simultaneously applying full left rudder, causing the helicopter to essentially stop in mid-air and rotate 90 degrees. The MiG pilot, traveling at over 500 miles per hour, shot past them like a bullet, unable to adjust his trajectory quickly enough to compensate for Sarah's unexpected maneuver. "Bulldog now," Sarah shouted. Thompson had anticipated her move and already had the lead MiG targeted. He fired a Hellfire missile at point-blank range, the weapon streaking through the night air before finding its mark. The enemy fighter exploded in a brilliant fireball, debris raining down into the valley below. But there were still 3 more jets to deal with, and Sarah knew they wouldn't fall for the same trick twice. "Devil 6-7, did you just shoot down a MiG with a Hellfire missile?" The voice of the radio controller was filled with disbelief. "Affirmative, Tower. 1 down, 3 to go." As the remaining enemy aircraft regrouped for another attack, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before in combat. Instead of fear or concern, she felt an almost euphoric rush of confidence. For the first time in her military career, she was facing a challenge that truly tested every skill she had developed over years of flying. The laughter that would become part of her legend started as a small chuckle over the radio, but it would grow into something that enemy pilots would remember long after the battle ended. The 3 remaining MiG-29s had spread into a wide formation, clearly adapting their tactics after witnessing their leader's unexpected demise. Sarah studied their movement patterns on her radar display, noting how they were positioning themselves for a coordinated attack from multiple directions. These weren't inexperienced pilots flying donated equipment. These were professionals who understood aerial warfare doctrine. "Ghost, they're trying to bracket us," Thompson observed, his voice tense but controlled. "If they attack simultaneously from different vectors, we won't be able to engage all of them." Sarah's mind worked through the tactical problem like a chess master contemplating her next move. Traditional helicopter doctrine called for immediate evasion and a desperate attempt to reach friendly air defense coverage. But they were operating in one of the most remote areas of Afghanistan, and the nearest friendly fighters were at least 30 minutes away. "Bulldog, what's the maximum range on our remaining Hellfires?" 8 kilometers under optimal conditions, but that's against stationary ground targets. "These MiGs can outrun our missiles if they detect the launch early enough." Sarah smiled grimly as a plan began to form in her mind. It was audacious to the point of insanity, but it just might work. She had spent her entire career studying every aspect of rotary wing aviation, including some very unconventional tactics developed by experimental test pilots. "I need you to trust me on this one, partner. We're going to use the terrain against them." Sarah dove the Apache toward the valley floor, using the mountainous landscape to break visual contact with the approaching fighters. The helicopter skimmed just 50 feet above the rocky ground, traveling at maximum speed through a narrow canyon that barely provided enough clearance for their rotor disc. "Jesus, Gości. My grandmother could walk faster than we're flying right now. Those MiGs are going to catch us in about 30 seconds. That's exactly what I'm counting on." Sarah had noticed something during her analysis of the enemy formation. The MiG pilots were flying with the confidence of hunters who believed they were pursuing helpless prey. That overconfidence would be their weakness because they weren't treating the Apache as a legitimate threat anymore. As they reached the end of the canyon, Sarah executed another impossible maneuver. She pulled the Apache into a nearly vertical climb while simultaneously rotating the aircraft 180 degrees. The helicopter essentially performed a backward loop, emerging from the canyon, flying in the opposite direction while maintaining forward airspeed. The lead MiG pilot, following them into the canyon at over 400 miles per hour, suddenly found himself facing an Apache helicopter at close range with nowhere to maneuver. The canyon walls that had provided Sarah with concealment now trapped the fighter jet in a corridor too narrow for evasive action. Thompson didn't need orders. He fired 2 Hellfire missiles in rapid succession, both weapons finding their target before the MiG pilot could react. The explosion lit up the entire canyon like daylight, and Sarah had to bank hard to avoid the debris field. "That's 2 down," she announced over the radio, and this time her laughter was clearly audible to anyone monitoring their frequency. Bulldog, how are we doing on fuel? We got about 40 minutes of flight time remaining, but Ghost, we're down to 4 Hellfires and our cannon ammunition. If those last 2 MiGs stay at altitude and attack with missiles, we're in serious trouble. Sarah checked her tactical display and saw that the remaining enemy fighters had indeed gained altitude and were circling at maximum range. They had apparently learned from the fate of their comrades, and were now approaching the engagement with considerably more caution. Tower, this is Devil 6-7. What's the status on backup? We could use some friendly fighters out here. Devil 6-7, nearest air support, is still 20 minutes out. Can you maintain evasive action until then? Sarah studied the tactical situation once more. 20 minutes was an eternity in aerial combat, especially when facing 2 professional pilots who now understood they were dealing with an unconventional opponent. She could attempt to flee, but the MiGs would eventually catch them in open terrain where their speed advantage would be decisive. Negative, Tower. We're going to finish this. The radio was silent for several seconds before the controller's voice returned, filled with disbelief. Say again, Devil 6-7? You heard me. Ghost out. Sarah began climbing toward the remaining MiGs, a move that defied every principle of helicopter tactics. Thompson watched their altitude increase with growing alarm as they left the protective terrain behind. Ghost, what are you doing? We're climbing right into their engagement envelope. Exactly. They're expecting us to run or hide. The last thing they'll anticipate is a head-on attack. As they gained altitude, Sarah could see both remaining MiGs clearly on her targeting system. They were maintaining a defensive formation, probably preparing to engage with long-range missiles the moment the Apache emerged from the mountains. What they didn't know was that Sarah had spent countless hours studying the technical specifications of Soviet Aerofighter aircraft. The MiG-29, while an excellent fighter, had one significant weakness. Its radar system had difficulty tracking targets flying directly toward it at low altitudes due to ground clutter interference. Bulldog, I need you to lock onto both targets simultaneously. When I give the word, fire everything we have left. Ghost, that's our entire remaining missile inventory. If we miss, we'll be defenseless. We won't miss. Sarah continued climbing until they reached 8,000 feet, well within the engagement range of both enemy fighters. She could see missile warning indicators beginning to flash on her display as the MiGs prepared to attack. The next few seconds would determine whether her unconventional tactics were brilliant or suicidal. At precisely the moment when both enemy fighters launched their missiles, Sarah executed the most dangerous maneuver of her career. She rolled the Apache inverted and dove straight down while simultaneously launching all 4 remaining Hellfire missiles. The enemy missiles, designed to track conventional aircraft flight patterns, lost their lock as the Apache's radar signature disappeared into the ground clutter below. Meanwhile, Sarah's missiles streaked upward toward the MiGs, whose pilots were momentarily blinded by the sun rising behind the Apache. Thompson watched his targeting display with fascination and terror as all 4 missiles found their marks. Direct hits on both targets. That's impossible. Hellfires aren't supposed to be effective against maneuvering fighters. They're not, Sarah replied as she pulled out of the dive, just a few hundred feet above the valley floor. But MiG pilots aren't supposed to be flying in a straight line when they're launching missiles either. The radio exploded with chatter as controllers and pilots across the region tried to process what had just happened. A single Apache helicopter had engaged 4 modern fighter aircraft and emerged victorious, using tactics that existed nowhere in any military manual. Devil 6-7, this is Overlord Actual, came a new voice over the radio, the calm, authoritative tone of a general officer. Please confirm your previous transmission. Did you just engage for enemy fighters? Affirmative, Overlord. For MiG-29s, all destroyed. No friendly casualties. There was a long pause before the general responded. Devil 6-7, you are ordered to return to base immediately for debriefing. This engagement will be classified at the highest levels until further notice. As Sarah turned the Apache toward home, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration unlike anything she had ever experienced. Thompson was unusually quiet, probably still processing the fact that they had survived what should have been a suicide mission. Bulldog, you okay back there? Yeah, Ghost, I'm Fina. I'm just trying to figure out how we're going to explain this in our after-action report. Engaged 4 enemy fighters with close air support weapons, and one sounds like something out of a video game. Sarah's laughter filled the intercom as she guided them back toward base. We'll let the intelligence people worry about the official version. All that matters is that we completed our mission and everyone goes home alive. Below them, the Special Forces team they had been supporting was already extracting with their high-value target in custody. The entire operation had taken less than 2 hours, but Sarah knew that those 2 hours would define the rest of her military career. As Forward Operating Base Chapman appeared on the horizon, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed during the engagement. She had always been a competent pilot, but tonight she had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed. The combination of unconventional thinking, technical expertise, and pure courage had allowed her to achieve something that military historians would debate for decades. The Apache touched down softly on the flight line as the sun rose over the Hindu Kush Mountains. Ground crews rushed to service the aircraft, their faces filled with questions that Sarah wasn't authorized to answer. Within minutes, she and Thompson were escorted to a secure briefing room where intelligence officers were already assembling to document every detail of their unprecedented engagement. But that was still hours away. For now, Sarah simply sat in her cockpit, helmet off, breathing the cool morning air and trying to process what had just happened. She had always known that combat aviation was as much art as science, but tonight she had painted a masterpiece that would inspire and mystify pilots for generations to come. The debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Chapman had been transformed into a temporary intelligence center overnight. Maps covered every wall, and multiple screens displayed satellite imagery of the engagement area. Sarah sat at a metal table facing a panel of officers whose rank insignia indicated this was no routine after-action review. General Patricia Hawthorne, commanding officer of all rotary wing operations in Afghanistan, leaned forward in her chair. She was a legend in Army aviation, having flown combat missions in both Iraq wars, and her presence at this debriefing indicated the extraordinary nature of the previous night's events. Captain Martinez, I've been flying helicopters for 28 years, and I've never heard of anything like what you accomplished last night. 4 modern fighter aircraft destroyed by a single Apache using air-to-surface missiles. I need to understand exactly how this was possible. Sarah had spent the past 6 hours in isolation, forbidden from discussing the engagement with anyone while intelligence officers verified the details through satellite imagery and radio intercepts. The physical evidence was undeniable. For destroyed aircraft, no friendly casualties, and one very confused enemy ground force that had lost their air support. General, the engagement succeeded because the enemy pilots underestimated both the Apache's capabilities and our willingness to engage unconventionally. They approached the fight with fixed-wing doctrine against rotary-wing aircraft, which gave us tactical advantages they didn't anticipate. Colonel James Mitchell, the base intelligence chief, consulted his tablet before speaking. Captain, our analysis of the radio intercepts reveals something disturbing. These weren't Taliban pilots flying captured aircraft. The communications were in Russian, and the tactical coordination suggests professional military training. We believe these were foreign advisors or mercenaries. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the room. If foreign powers were directly engaging American forces with modern military aircraft, it represented a significant escalation in the conflict that could have far-reaching political consequences. Lieutenant Thompson, who had been silent throughout the questioning, finally spoke up. Sir, permission to speak freely? Granted, Lieutenant. What Captain Martinez accomplished last night wasn't just about tactics or luck. She demonstrated an understanding of aerial warfare that goes beyond anything we're taught in flight school. When those MiGs appeared, she didn't hesitate or request backup. She immediately began analyzing their weaknesses and developing countermeasures. General Hawthorne turned her attention back to Sarah. Captain, walk me through your decision-making process during the engagement. Why did you choose to attack rather than evade? Sarah had been anticipating this question since the moment she landed. Her decision to engage had violated numerous protocols, and could easily be interpreted as reckless endangerment of government property and personnel. General, evasion would have meant abandoning the Special Forces team during their extraction. The MiGs were specifically targeting our aircraft, which meant they knew our mission parameters and timing. If we had fled, they would have pursued us until we ran out of fuel or led them to other friendly forces. That's a reasonable assessment, but it doesn't explain your tactical choices during the engagement itself. Sarah stood and moved to the tactical display showing the engagement area. The MiG-29 is an excellent interceptor, but it was designed for high-altitude combat against strategic bombers and enemy fighters. Operating at low altitude in mountainous terrain degrades many of its key advantages: speed, radar range, and missile effectiveness. She traced the route of the engagement on a map. By using the terrain to force close-range encounters, I could negate their speed advantage and exploit the superior maneuverability of the Apache at low air speeds. The Hellfire missile, while designed for ground targets, is essentially a precision-guided rocket. At close range against aircraft flying predictable flight paths, it becomes an effective air-to-air weapon. Colonel Mitchell made notes as she spoke. What about the psychological aspect? Our analysis suggests the enemy pilots became increasingly erratic as the engagement progressed. Sarah smiled, remembering the radio chatter they had monitored during the fight. The laughter wasn't intentional psychological warfare, sir. I was genuinely enjoying the challenge. But it probably did contribute to their confusion. Fighter pilots expect helicopter crews to be terrified during air-to-air encounters, not amused. General Hawthorne exchanged glances with her staff before continuing. Captain Martinez, what you accomplished last night has implications far beyond this single engagement. You've demonstrated that properly employed rotary-wing aircraft can engage fixed-wing fighters under specific circumstances. This could change how we approach air defense and close air support missions worldwide. The weight of that statement wasn't lost on Sarah. Military doctrine developed over decades could be influenced by a single engagement if the lessons were properly analyzed and implemented. General, I should emphasize that the specific circumstances of last night's engagement were unique. The terrain, weather conditions, enemy tactics, and even the timing all contributed to the outcome. I wouldn't recommend that other Apache crews attempt similar engagements without extensive preparation and support. Understood, Captain. But the fundamental principles you employed, using terrain to negate enemy advantages, exploiting the limitations of their weapon systems, and maintaining the initiative through aggressive action, these are applicable to many different scenarios. Dr. Elizabeth Crenshaw, a civilian analyst from the Pentagon, had been observing quietly throughout the debriefing. She finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing senior government officials. Captain Martinez, we've been analyzing the technical aspects of your engagement, and there are some elements that concern us. The maneuvers you performed with the Apache pushed the aircraft well beyond its documented performance envelope. How did you know the helicopter could handle those stresses? Sarah had been dreading this question. Her knowledge of the Apache's capabilities came from years of pushing the aircraft to its limits during training exercises, often against the explicit instructions of her supervisors. Ma'am, I've always believed that understanding an aircraft's true capabilities requires testing its boundaries under controlled conditions. During training flights, I would experiment with unusual maneuvers and flight profiles to develop a comprehensive understanding of what the Apache could achieve. General Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. Captain, are you telling me you've been conducting unauthorized test flights? Not unauthorized, General, but perhaps more aggressive than typical training profiles. Every maneuver I performed last night had been tested previously during solo flights over unpopulated areas. The room fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. Sarah had essentially conducted her own experimental test program, developing capabilities that didn't exist in any official manual. Dr. Crenshaw consulted her notes. Captain, we'd like you to work with our test pilots to document these unconventional maneuvers. If they can be standardized and taught to other crews, we could significantly enhance the survivability of helicopter operations in contested airspace. I'd be honored to participate in such a program, ma'am. Colonel Mitchell closed his folder and addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've gathered sufficient information for our initial assessment. Captain Martinez, Lieutenant Thompson, you're both being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Your actions last night saved lives and demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire. As the formal debriefing concluded, General Hawthorne asked Sarah to remain behind for a private conversation. Once the room emptied, the general's formal demeanor softened slightly. Sarah, off the record, what you accomplished last night was extraordinary. But I need to know, are you okay? Engaging 4 fighters single-handedly is the kind of stress that can break even the strongest pilots. Sarah considered the question carefully. She had expected to feel traumatized or overwhelmed by the experience, but instead she felt energized and confident. The engagement had revealed capabilities she never knew she possessed. General, I feel fine. Better than fine, actually. For the first time in my career, I was facing a challenge that required everything I had learned about flying. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. That concerns me, Captain. Combat stress manifests differently in different people. I'm ordering you to speak with our flight surgeon and undergo a complete psychological evaluation. Yes, ma'am. There's something else. This engagement is being classified at the highest levels, but word has already spread through the aviation community. You're going to find that your life has changed significantly. Every pilot in the military is going to want to know how you did it. Sarah nodded, already anticipating the challenges that fame would bring. She had always preferred to let her flying speak for itself, but that luxury was now gone. General, permission to ask a question? Granted. What happens to my normal flying duties? Will I still be able to fly combat missions? General Hawthorne smiled for the first time since the debriefing began. Captain, you've just proven that helicopter warfare is far more complex than we previously understood. I suspect you'll be very busy developing new tactics and training the next generation of combat pilots. Your flying career is just getting started. As Sarah left the briefing room, she realized that everything she had worked for had changed in a single night. She was no longer just another Apache pilot. She had become the woman who laughed while destroying fighter jets, and that reputation would follow her for the rest of her life. 6 months after the engagement in Afghanistan, Captain Sarah Martinez found herself at the Army Aviation Center of Excellence in Fort Rucker, Alabama, facing a classroom filled with the military's most experienced helicopter pilots. The students included seasoned combat veterans, test pilots, and international exchange officers from allied nations. All had come to learn the tactics that had made her engagement legendary within the aviation community. The classroom was equipped with the most advanced flight simulation technology available, allowing pilots to experience realistic air-to-air combat scenarios without the risks associated with live-fire training. Sarah stood before a large tactical display showing a 3-dimensional representation of the Korangal Valley engagement. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to discuss today challenges fundamental assumptions about rotary wing combat doctrine. Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence that had developed over months of teaching and analyzing her unconventional tactics. The key to successful helicopter air-to-air engagement isn't about matching the performance characteristics of fixed-wing aircraft. It's about understanding and exploiting their limitations. Major Robert Shun, a Cobra pilot with 15 years of combat experience, raised his hand. Captain Martinez, traditional doctrine teaches us to avoid air-to-air engagement at all costs. How do we balance aggressive tactics with reasonable risk management? Sarah had fielded this question countless times during her tenure as an instructor. The balance between calculated risk and reckless endangerment was a fine line that every combat pilot had to navigate. Major, the key is understanding when engagement is unavoidable and being prepared for that scenario. In my case, evasion would have meant abandoning ground forces under fire. Sometimes the tactical situation requires accepting higher risks to accomplish the mission. She manipulated the display to show the positioning of all aircraft during the engagement. Notice that I didn't seek out the enemy fighters. They came to me. Once they committed to the engagement, my options became limited. I could either fight on their terms or change the rules of engagement entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Andrea Walsh, a British exchange officer flying Apache aircraft for the Royal Army Air Corps, studied the tactical display intently. Captain Martinez, your use of terrain was particularly clever, but it required intimate knowledge of the operational area. How do we apply these principles in unfamiliar territory? Excellente question, Colonel. Terrain analysis becomes critical for survival. Every helicopter pilot should be able to identify natural features that can be used to mask movement, force enemy aircraft into disadvantageous positions, or provide emergency landing sites. The specific terrain features don't matter as much as understanding how to use whatever is available. Sarah advanced to the next slide, showing radar signatures and missile tracking data from the engagement. This brings us to the technical aspects of the encounter. The MiG-29's radar system has known limitations when tracking targets at low altitude in cluttered terrain. By staying below the radar horizon and using ground clutter, I could remain undetected until choosing to reveal my position. Captain David Park, a Republic of Korea Air Force pilot, examined the missile tracking data with professional interest. Captain, the Hellfire missile wasn't designed for air-to-air engagement. How did you modify the targeting procedures to achieve successful intercepts? I didn't modify anything, Captain. The Hellfire is essentially a precision-guided rocket with a sophisticated seeker head. At close range against predictable targets, it functions perfectly well as an air-to-air weapon. The key was forcing the enemy aircraft into flight patterns that made them vulnerable to weapons designed for ground targets. The technical discussion continued for several hours, with Sarah explaining every aspect of the engagement in detail. Her students took extensive notes, clearly recognizing that they were learning tactics that might save their lives in future combat situations. During a break between sessions, Sarah stepped outside to clear her head. The Alabama heat was oppressive compared to the mountain air of Afghanistan, but she had grown to appreciate the peaceful environment of the training base. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Thompson, who is now serving as a standardization instructor pilot in Germany. Saw the news about the new Apache upgrades. Heard they're calling the air-to-air modification package the Ghost Protocol. Thought you should know your tactics are becoming official doctrine. Miss flying with you, partner. Sarah smiled as she read the message. The military had indeed developed formal air-to-air engagement procedures based on her tactics, complete with modified weapon systems and specialized training programs. What had started as improvisation under fire was becoming standardized doctrine for helicopter operations worldwide. Her reflection was interrupted by the appearance of General Hawthorne, who had arrived for the afternoon session. The general had become a strong advocate for Sarah's unconventional training methods, often attending classes to observe student progress firsthand. How are they responding to the training, Captain? Very well, General. Most of these pilots have never considered air-to-air engagement as a realistic scenario, so there's a steep learning curve. But once they understand the principles, they adapt quickly. Any resistance to the unconventional approach? Sarah considered the question carefully. Some traditional pilots had indeed struggled with tactics that contradicted everything they had learned during their careers. Some initial skepticism, which is healthy. These are experienced professionals who understand that bad tactics get people killed. They want to thoroughly understand the concepts before implementing them in training. General Hawthorne nodded approvingly. That's exactly the attitude we want. Blind acceptance would be just as dangerous as blind rejection. As they returned to the classroom for the afternoon session, Sarah noticed that several new faces had joined the group. Among them was Colonel Samuel Morrison, the commanding officer of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers. Captain Martinez, Colonel Morrison said as he approached, I've been following your work with great interest. The Special Operations community is particularly intrigued by your terrain masking techniques. We operate in contested airspace regularly and could benefit from enhanced survivability measures. Colonel, I'd be honored to work with your pilots. Special operations crews already possess many of the skills necessary for unconventional air combat, advanced navigation, precision flying, and the ability to think creatively under pressure. The afternoon session focused on practical application of the theoretical concepts discussed earlier. Students took turns in flight simulators, attempting to replicate the maneuvers that had made Sarah's engagement successful. Captain Park was the first to successfully complete a simulated air-to-air engagement using helicopter tactics. His target was a computer-generated MiG-29 flying a profile similar to the aircraft Sarah had encountered in Afghanistan. Excellent work, Captain, Sarah said as he emerged from the simulator. Your use of the canyon walls to force a close-range engagement was textbook execution. How did it feel? Terrifying and exhilarating, Park replied with a grin. I can understand why you were laughing during your engagement. There's something incredible about succeeding when everyone expects you to fail. Major Chun was less successful in his first attempt, falling victim to the superior speed and firepower of a simulated enemy fighter. Sarah reviewed his performance with him, identifying specific points where alternative tactics might have changed the outcome. Major, you flew the engagement like a traditional air-to-air encounter. Remember, we're not trying to match their performance. We're trying to force them to fight our type of battle. I see the problem, Chen replied, studying his flight path on the display. I maintained too much altitude and gave the MiG room to maneuver. I should have stayed low and used terrain masking until I could force a close encounter. Exactly. The helicopter's advantages only become apparent when we negate the fighter's primary strengths, speed, and standoff capability. As the training day concluded, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction that had become familiar over the months since her return from Afghanistan. Teaching other pilots to survive encounters that should be unsurvivable was perhaps even more rewarding than her own combat achievements. General Hawthorne addressed the class during the final session. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've learned today represents a fundamental evolution in rotary wing combat doctrine. Captain Martinez has demonstrated that helicopters can engage fixed-wing aircraft successfully under specific circumstances. This knowledge could save lives and change the outcome of future conflicts. Colonel Morrison approached Sarah as the students began filing out of the classroom. Captain, I have a proposition for you. The 160th is developing a new special operations capability that would benefit from your expertise. Are you interested in returning to operational flying? Sarah's heart raced at the possibility of returning to combat operations. Teaching was rewarding, but she missed the adrenaline rush and immediate purpose of operational flying. What kind of operations, Colonel? I can't discuss specifics in an unclassified environment, but let's just say that your unique skill set has applications beyond conventional combat scenarios. You'll be working with our most experienced crews on missions that push the boundaries of helicopter capabilities. I'm definitely interested, sir. Excellent. I'll have my staff contact you with details. Fair warning. This assignment will likely take you to places that make Afghanistan look peaceful. As Sarah watched Colonel Morrison leave, she realized that her career was entering yet another phase. The engagement that had started as a routine support mission was continuing to open doors she never could have imagined. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from her father in Texas. Saw the article about the new Apache tactics in Aviation Week. Proud of you, Mija. Your mother says to call home more often. Love, Dad. Sarah laughed as she gathered her teaching materials. Some things never changed, regardless of how many enemy fighters she might destroy or how many tactical innovations she might develop. She was still a daughter who needed to call home more often, and that grounding in ordinary life kept her centered despite the extraordinary nature of her professional achievements. 3 years after her legendary engagement in Afghanistan, Major Sarah Martinez found herself in the co-pilot seat of a modified Apache helicopter flying through the darkness over the South China Sea. The aircraft bore known national markings and carried experimental equipment that existed in no official inventory. Her pilot was Chief Warrant Officer Kevin Reaper Sullivan, one of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment's most experienced aviators. Ghost, we're approaching the target area, Sullivan reported through the secure communication system. Intelligence reports 3 unknown aircraft conducting surveillance operations near international shipping lanes. Rules of engagement are weapons-free if they demonstrate hostile intent. Sarah studied the mission parameters on her tactical display. The aircraft they were hunting weren't flying for any recognized military force, but satellite imagery suggested they were equipped with advanced reconnaissance equipment and possible weapon systems. Their activities had disrupted commercial shipping and raised tensions throughout the region. The past 3 years had transformed Sarah from a decorated combat pilot into something approaching a legend within the military aviation community. Her unconventional tactics have been studied, refined, and incorporated into training programs worldwide. More importantly, they had proven effective in dozens of subsequent engagements as conflicts around the globe had intensified. Reaper, what's our backup situation? 2F-22 Raptors are orbiting 50 miles south of our position, but they're under orders not to intervene unless we specifically request assistance. This mission is designated as a rotary wing capability demonstration. Sarah understood the implication. Senior military leaders wanted to know if helicopter-based air-to-air tactics could be applied beyond the specific circumstances of her original engagement. Success would validate years of tactical development and training investment. Failure could end the program and possibly cost lives. Target bearing 090, range 15 kilometers, and closing, Sullivan reported. Multiple contacts, probably flying in formation. Sarah activated her targeting systems, immediately identifying 3 aircraft flying in a loose wedge formation. The radar signatures suggested they were modified civilian aircraft equipped with military-grade electronics, a common configuration for covert operations. Reaper, these aren't fighters. Looks like modified transport or business aircraft. Threat level is probably minimal unless they're carrying air-to-air missiles. Roger that. Still, 3 against 1 isn't great odds if they decide to get aggressive. Sarah smiled as familiar feelings of anticipation and confidence began building. 3 years of analyzing her original engagement had revealed additional principles that she had applied intuitively during combat. Now, she could implement those tactics deliberately, with full understanding of their theoretical foundation. Unknown aircraft, this is coalition forces. You are operating in restricted airspace. Identify yourself and state your intentions. The radio remained silent for several long seconds before a heavily accented voice responded. Coalition aircraft, we are conducting legitimate research operations in international airspace. We have no hostile intentions. Sarah studied the radar tracks of the unknown aircraft. Their flight pattern was clearly designed for surveillance rather than research, and their response suggested they weren't planning to leave voluntarily. Unknown aircraft, you are directed to depart this area immediately. Any attempt to continue surveillance operations will be considered hostile activity. This time a response came much quicker, and the tone had changed significantly. Coalition aircraft, we have as much right to operate in international airspace as you do. We will continue our mission as planned. Sullivan glanced at Sarah through his night vision system. Ghost, they're not backing down. Your call on how to proceed. Sarah analyzed the tactical situation with the systematic approach she had developed over years of teaching and practical application. The enemy aircraft had superior numbers, but were flying predictably and showed no indication of advanced combat training. Their modified civilian platforms would be vulnerable to the same close-range tactics that had proven effective against military fighters. Reaper, let's give them one more chance to leave peacefully. If they refuse, we'll demonstrate why that's a bad decision. Unknown aircraft, this is your final warning. Depart this area immediately or face the consequences. The response came as a change in the enemy formation rather than a radio transmission. All 3 aircraft began accelerating and turning toward the Apache, clearly preparing for some form of aggressive action. Looks like they've made their choice, Ghost. Roger that. Let's show them what we've learned. Sarah had spent 3 years refining the tactics that had made her famous, working with test pilots and combat veterans to develop standardized procedures for helicopter air-to-air engagement. What had been improvisation during her original encounter was now a systematic approach to asymmetric aerial warfare. Reaper, take us down to wave-top level and increase speed to maximum. I want to force them into a low-altitude engagement where their aircraft performance will be degraded. Sullivan pushed the Apache into a steep dive, racing toward the ocean surface at nearly 200 miles per hour. The modified aircraft above them followed, apparently confident that their superior numbers would be decisive in any engagement. Ghost, they're staying in formation instead of spreading out. That suggests they don't have extensive air combat training. Perfect. We use that against them. As the Apache leveled off just 50 feet above the ocean surface, Sarah began executing a tactic she had developed specifically for multi-aircraft engagements. Instead of trying to engage all 3 aircraft simultaneously, she would use their formation flying against them. Reaper, execute a hard left turn toward the lead aircraft. I want to force them to break formation or risk collision. The Apache banked sharply toward the leading enemy aircraft, which responded exactly as Sarah had anticipated. The pilot broke left to avoid collision, disrupting the formation and creating separation between the three aircraft. Target the lead aircraft with a Hellfire. Fire on my command. Sarah waited until the lead aircraft was isolated from its companions before giving the order to fire. The missile streaked across the dark water before finding its target in a brilliant explosion that illuminated the entire formation. The remaining two aircraft immediately abandoned their aggressive posture, turning away from the Apache and climbing rapidly. But Sarah wasn't finished with them yet. Reaper, pursue the nearest target. Let's see if they want to continue this engagement. The Apache raced after the fleeing aircraft, easily matching their speed at low altitude. Sarah could see that the enemy pilot was panicking, making erratic maneuvers that only made him a better target. Firing second Hellfire. The missile impact was even more spectacular than the first, the explosion reflecting off the ocean surface like a deadly fireworks display. The third aircraft was now alone and fleeing at maximum speed. Ghost, should we pursue the remaining target? Sarah considered the tactical situation. The mission objective had been accomplished, and the surviving aircraft no longer posed a threat to shipping operations. More importantly, she had successfully demonstrated that her tactics could be applied beyond the specific circumstances of her original engagement. Negative Reaper. Let him go. He'll carry the message back to whoever sent them that this airspace is being actively defended. As they turned toward home, Sarah reflected on how much her approach to combat had evolved since her legendary engagement in Afghanistan. The basic principles remained the same. Use terrain and tactics to negate enemy advantages, maintain the initiative through aggressive action, and exploit the limitations of enemy systems. But the application had become more sophisticated and deliberate. Reaper, how do you think that compared to the training scenarios? Honestly, Ghost, it was almost too easy. Those pilots weren't prepared for helicopter air-to-air tactics. They were probably expecting us to run away or call for backup. That's the key to the whole concept. Most pilots, even experienced ones, have never faced aggressive helicopter tactics. Their training and doctrine don't prepare them for aircraft that refuse to behave like helicopters are supposed to behave. The flight back to their base ship provided time for Sarah to consider the broader implications of the successful mission. Her tactics were now being taught at military academies worldwide, and several allied nations had developed their own versions of the helicopter air-to-air program. But more importantly, the success of these unconventional tactics was changing fundamental assumptions about aerial warfare. Military planners were beginning to recognize that technological superiority alone wasn't sufficient to guarantee victory. Creative thinking, aggressive tactics, and the willingness to violate conventional doctrine could overcome significant disadvantages in equipment and numbers. Ghost, we're approaching the ship. Mission Control is requesting a preliminary debrief as soon as we land. Roger that. Tell them the demonstration was successful and all objectives were accomplished. As the Apache settled onto the deck of the amphibious assault ship, Sarah felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. Each successful engagement validated the principles she had discovered during that desperate fight in Afghanistan years earlier. More importantly, it demonstrated that individual courage and creativity could still make a difference in an era of increasingly sophisticated military technology. The ground crew secured the aircraft quickly, and Sarah was immediately escorted to a secure communications facility for debriefing with senior commanders around the world. The mission had been monitored by officials from multiple allied nations, all eager to understand the practical application of helicopter air-to-air tactics. Major Martinez, this is General Thompson at the Pentagon. Congratulations on another successful demonstration. Your tactics continue to exceed our expectations. Thank you, General. The enemy aircraft were less challenging than anticipated, but the engagement confirmed that our procedures are effective against a variety of target types. Understood, Major. We're prepared to authorize full-scale implementation of the Ghost Protocol across all services. Your unconventional approach to aerial warfare has proven itself beyond any doubt. As the debriefing concluded, Sarah walked onto the ship's flight deck and looked up at the stars visible in the clear night sky. Somewhere above, satellites were monitoring conflicts around the globe, where helicopter crews, trained in her tactics, were engaging superior enemy forces and emerging victorious. The laughter that had echoed through the radio frequencies over Afghanistan had become something more significant, a symbol of human ingenuity triumphing over technological intimidation. Her legacy wasn't just about destroying enemy aircraft. It was about proving that creative thinking and courage could overcome any disadvantage. Years later, when military historians analyzed the evolution of aerial warfare in the early 21st century, they would identify Major Sarah Ghost Martinez as the pilot who fundamentally changed how the world thought about helicopter combat. But that night, standing on a ship's deck in the South China Sea, she was simply a professional aviator who had learned to laugh in the face of impossible odds and turn that laughter into victory.